Welcome in, y'all. The off season is in full swing. We're just about to kick off free agency here in about a week or two. And I want to look at the biggest needs for every team. I already covered AFC. This is going to be covering the NFC. A lot of teams have several different needs. Some I touch on a couple more than others. But let's just jump into it. We'll go division by division, and we'll start here with the NFC South. This is a division that, you had the 8 and 9 Carolina Panthers get into the playoffs via a 3-way tiebreaker, between, the Falcons, Bucks, and Panthers. Kind of a chaotic year in the South. We'll see how it shapes up this year, but we'll start in the top left. We'll start with the Atlanta Falcons, and I think their biggest need is wide receiver depth. You have Drake London out there, and then I know he's not a receiver. We got Kyle Pitts. The offense is in good shape. Bijan. But after Drake London, you're lacking a bit, especially, with some stuff that's going to happen, as far as losing some pieces. And if you're running it back with Penix, which it sounds like they are, I'm not the biggest fan of him. I think his ceiling isn't very high, but you need support out there. You need a good... you need good wide receiver targets outside of just Drake London, right? And the defense is in pretty good shape, right? They're going to add some pieces to it, of course, in the offseason, but it played pretty well against some good teams this year. They need some wide receiver depth. They need to help Penix grow. Tampa Bay, there was a lot of different defensive spots to look at here, but I'm going to go with edge rusher on them. They brought in some pieces last offseason that would hope to kind of fix that, and they didn't quite pan out how they thought they would. So they're hoping to, bring in even more this offseason, whether through free agency or the draft. But they got to fix that side of the ball right now. And then all around, they need health. It's been a really banged up team. We'll see, what pieces they keep and not, but they got to stay healthy. That's probably their biggest thing, to be honest. New Orleans, I went with wide receiver or interior offensive line. So at wideout, they already have a couple good pieces out there, but you got a young quarterback, and it seems like they're sticking with Shuck, and he played decent, this year, and maybe they try to make him their guy. But if you want to do that, same thing I said for Penix in Atlanta, you got to have as much help as you can get out there. They have a lot of holes on this team, of course. That's not to say a ton of other positions aren't an issue, but I think when you have a young QB, that's important. And of course, interior offensive line, a lot of the pressure he was facing was coming up the middle there. They got to shore that up, give him more time to throw, and improve the running game a bit as well. For Carolina, I went with inside linebacker here. They didn't have the right pieces there this year, and you saw it, in the playoffs a bit. They were getting picked apart, not great in coverage. It's just they're much better on the outside than inside. They got to fix that. For a team that won the division, mind you, we all know they had a losing record. They have a good amount of holes. The roster needs a lot of tune-up work, but that's certainly a place to start. I hope they can continue to grow this team. I'd like to see Bryce Young succeed, but they're oddly low in all the odds this year for division. Super Bowl, if you want to think that far. But we'll see how the year goes. They're hoping to improve on the 8-9 record. I think it starts at that spot there. Then we'll move on over to the NFC East. Cowboys, Giants, Eagles, Commanders. All four teams, in my opinion, have the ability to be pretty solid football teams this year. This division could be kind of scary. Or, I don't know about scary, but very competitive. Some teams obviously have better chances to win it than others. The Eagles back-to-back, but I wouldn't be shocked if you told me any of these teams won the division this upcoming year. But let's start with the Cowboys. I went all-encompassing here. They need defense. This is almost the same. They're like a slightly toned-down version of the Bengals, right? Where the offense is just elite. You can trust it. They have playmakers there. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's some things they could shore up on that side of the ball, but it's defense that holds them back. If they could just get an average defense, they will likely be in the playoffs, and that can start at any position. Pick your poison. You go secondary, edge rusher. You can go anywhere. They need help basically all around. A couple spots are all right, but they got to fix the defense up. If they can put some pieces on that side of the ball and keep the offense intact, they're going to be a dangerous team this year. The Giants, I went with the secondary in general, especially this is factored in because you're bringing in Harbaugh. He's great at working with that position. He believes in a very strong secondary, especially at the safety position. And I think it's something the Giants are going to focus on, that they need to focus on under him. And I think this team, it really isn't as far away as it might seem like they are. They had a really tough schedule this past year. They played a lot of close games that ended up in losses. If they can stay healthy and Dart can improve, he showed some really good flashes. If he can continue to improve, I think the Giants could be scary with Harbaugh as the hire. And I think they need to shore up that secondary there. I think they will. For Philadelphia, wide receiver / tight end. This was kind of we don't know what they're doing with A.J. Brown yet, or at least the time I'm making this. So, if they keep him, they have Devonta Smith. I mean, wide receiver isn't quite as a priority, but if they were to lose A.J. Brown, they really got to focus on getting another guy out there, another playmaker. And then the tight end is something you probably need to worry about regardless. At the time of this, it seems like Goddard will probably be leaving Philadelphia. And, he was a big piece, obviously, in pass catching, but also in the run blocking game. And they don't have too much, good depth behind him. They're going to need to pick up another tight end if he does walk. So both of those positions on offense, pretty big shoes to fill if those departures do happen. And then for the Commanders, I promise I'm not doing this all the time, but just two in the same division here. I went with just defense in general again. You can pinpoint positions, but at the end of the day, especially with them being fairly high up in the draft, you could borderline just go best available on defense because they need help on a lot of spots. It's a very aging defense that did not play well this year. Other teams, they were really just carving them up at times. I know the offense didn't give them much help, as far as complementary football goes, but this defense needs a lot of work. You're gonna get Jaden Daniels coming back healthy. So the offense should be a lot better. They have a ton of cap space to work with this offseason. I think they can put a pretty good team out there. I think they're an underrated team to look out for going into 2026. We'll move on over to the NFC North, a division won by the Chicago Bears, a team that is third in the odds to win the division this year. Packers and Lions in front there. And this is going to be an incredibly difficult and competitive division. All four teams are going to be at minimum above average, and I think you have at least two elite teams here. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch. But the Bears, I just went with the defensive line here. They need more pressure on the quarterback. First things first, they were not good at getting to quarterbacks, but they also were not good at stopping the run. They were giving up a lot of yards per carry. Like, running backs were incredibly efficient against Chicago. The defense as a whole wasn't spectacular, but they definitely need to shore up that D line. The games are won in the trenches, and that's also where they're lost. I think in their playoff loss, they weren't getting to Stafford much. I don't recall them getting to Jordan Love too much either. So they got to fix that. Minnesota. Biggest need is going to be safety, right? If Smith is indeed retiring, they're going to need to fix that position. It's crucial for, kind of the play style they have there in Minnesota with Flores. And they're going to need to, that's a big shoes to fill there, but it's going to be important. But really, this Minnesota team, when I was looking through it, pretty solid roster. Top to bottom. I said it going into last year. I think they ended up with a much better record than it felt like they should have had. But this is a very good team if they can figure out that quarterback spot, if McCarthy can play better. Green Bay, I'm with the center here. There's a couple other spots you could think about as well. But this is a team that it really is, it's pretty well built. It's pretty well fleshed out. There's not too many spots that are lacking, starter talent. There's plenty of spots you could obviously add some, superstar talent to. I feel like this is one of those teams that's more like even across the board. They have, a superstar or two, but it's mostly just solid starters, and it's a pretty well-rounded roster in my opinion. But center, I think that's a position that's going to be of need of a starter this offseason. Detroit, offensive tackle, right? The offensive line had issues this past year. I know there was injuries there as well, but they got to shore up that spot. The Lions, their system, the way they play football with the personnel they have is built on the O-line. I know every team is, but specifically them. Goff is not a guy that is breaking out of the pocket, and making plays on his own if the O-line forces him to. He's a guy who sits back there, he needs time, and then the running game, it's built off it. They want to win in the trenches, be efficient on the ground, play action. They need to shore up the offensive line. It starts at the tackle position. The interior was pretty decent this year. Then we'll move to the NFC West. This division, minus the one obvious team, is pretty darn good, right? You had 3 playoff teams. They were 3 of the final 4 teams standing in the NFC this year. And really, again, for 3 of the 4, they should be right back in contention. The Cardinals still have a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, they're kind of entering a rebuild time, even though it seems like they were just in one. But let's start at the top left there. We'll start with the Rams and a couple obvious spots. The two things that lost them games this year, the cornerback position. The personnel they trotted out the cornerback position this year was just not acceptable for a Super Bowl caliber team. And I think that kind of did them in against Seattle, right? You saw them give up 31 points in that game. And then special teams. Their special teams, it was very horrible this year. You had fumbled punts. You had numerous blocked kicks, blocked punts, given up punt returns. It just wasn't good. And that's a tough spot, right, when it's a position of need, because those aren't like starter players that are often filling a lot of those holes. They're depth players that play special teams. So, you got to find the right guys, maybe a specialist returner. I don't know if it starts with the special teams coach, but they got to figure that out. It cost them several games. San Francisco, I thought they were more well structured than maybe they are when I started digging into them here. And I'm like, wow, they actually have a lot of positions that definitely need some help. You could look at defensive, right? They got next to no pressure on quarterbacks this year, but they had their 2 starting defensive ends out. So when they come back this year, it's hard to know how big of a position of need that is. They still obviously need some depth there because, you have another injury. You can't go back to getting, like a sack a game or less. But wide receiver and left guard are 2 big spots. Wide receiver, it's a mess out there. They don't know what they're doing. Injuries, Ayuk's departing, Pearsall, again, injuries. They need some playmakers at receiver. And then at left guard, they need to shore up that position because the running game this year, you had Christian McCaffrey hid some of the woes of that offensive line there in that position. But if you look at yards per carry for McCaffrey as well, and the entire 49ers, it is not good. It is incredibly, alarmingly inefficient. They have to fix that. They got to fix both those positions. But it's a tell that they had these issues this year, and they were still able to win as many games as they did, get as far as they did. If they can shore up those spots, they're going to be a pretty darn good team with Shanahan leading once again. Then we'll move on to the Super Bowl champion Seattle Seahawks. When you win the Super Bowl, usually you have less holes to fill. That is certainly the case. I think some of the biggest needs, center and right guard, some of the parts of that interior offensive line needs some help, right? The left guard spot was pretty solid. Right guard, I think just needs to be replaced. Played better towards the end of the year, but it still was not great. One of their bigger weaknesses, defensively, what cornerbacks are going to walk in free agency here, it's hard to say yet. They could have more of a need there than it feels right now. We'll have to wait and see, but at the moment, those are the positions focused on for Seattle. Arizona, last but not least, they might be least in the standings. I went with offensive line here. You could go quarterback. Obviously, they got to figure out what they're doing with Kyler, but they have more pressing matters during a rebuild. They got to go O-line, and they could use a little wide receiver help as well. Maybe some depth out there, but the offensive line is an issue, and it has been, and they need to fix that. And they have a great opportunity to picking high in the draft. I think that's more than likely where they will go there. But we will have to wait and see. Draft a couple months away. But let me know what y'all think. These are the positions I think, the NFC teams need to focus on. And, we'll be breaking down free agency as it happens, looking, what spots are filled and what spots still need to be filled when that draft starts coming up. So, we're getting into the offseason here, and, the March to September is on.